Welcome in, everybody, ready to dive deep again. This time we're tackling someone who's, well, a bit of a puzzle, even with all the research we've done. Aristóbulo Istúriz.
And with the material you sent, it's fascinating stuff. Really gets to the heart of things in Venezuela.
It really does, and we want to be upfront. We're focusing on those accusations you shared, the ones leveled against Istúriz. But of course, there's always more to the story, right? It's just with this deep dive, these specific points are our focus.
Right. And what makes it so interesting is this isn't just about one guy. It's like a thread through a huge chunk of Venezuela's history.
Totally. I mean, we're talking about someone described on one hand as a beloved educator, and then on the other, well, some sources allege she might have used that very system for personal gain.
That contract is what's so captivating. You want to understand how those two things can exist in one person.
Exactly. So to unpack that, we have to go back, right, to Istúriz's beginnings. Teacher, then union leader, which kind of painted him as a man of the people early on.
And that image, it's crucial to his whole story, both the rise and those accusations he faced.
So picture this. 1970s, Istúriz is fighting for teachers' rights. That seems to be what really kicks off his political life. He joins the Movimiento al Socialismo, the MAS party.
Right. But then comes the real turning point.
Yeah.
He decides to throw his lot in with a young Hugo Chavez and his party, the MVR.
Big move.
Huge. This puts him right in the middle of what becomes the PSUV, Chavez's party, and that's where he climbs the ladder, eventually becoming Minister of Education.
And that's where those accusations you sent come in, right? The corruption allegations, especially during his time as minister.
Serious stuff.
Yeah, one article from Tal Cual Digital, it alleges he was basically taking funds meant for schools and using them to strengthen the PSUV's hold on power. They even use the term systematic looting.
That's what makes these accusations so troubling, right? It suggests public money meant for education might have been used for political means, a breach of trust if it's true.
And it makes you wonder about the impact on Venezuela's education system at such a critical time.
Exactly.
But it wasn't just about money. The stuff you sent also mentions this pattern of what they call cronyism and clientelism. Basically, that Istúriz might have been putting loyalists in key spots, maybe even undermining democratic processes.
And this goes back to that loyalty to Chavez we talked about, right?
Yeah.
It seems like that loyalty might be at the root of a lot of these accusations. Critics say it created a situation where being competent wasn't as important as being on their side.
And that's a scary thought when you're talking about running a country. And nowhere is it more concerning than in those allegations around what your sources called the militarization of education.
Yeah, and that phrase, militarization of education, it really stuck out from one of the articles you sent, and it's a loaded one, right? Makes you think about what was really going on in Venezuela's schools under Istúriz.
It's about more than just who's in the classroom, isn't it? It gets at what those students are learning, and maybe even more importantly, what they're not learning.
Exactly. Like,
Yeah.
were they being taught to think for themselves? Right, that's the big question. So we're talking about Bolivarian education, which is what Istúriz called his big education reform. On the surface, you might think, okay, trying to improve things.
That sounds good so far.
Right, but a lot of critics saw it as something way more calculated, like trying to instill a specifically pro-PSUV ideology in kids.
Wow. And the sources you sent, they seem to back that up, talking about a really pervasive approach, not just adding a paragraph to a textbook here and there.
No, we're talking woven into everything, from math class to literature, at least that's what they're alleging.
So it's like, imagine being a teacher in that system, right? You're not just teaching anymore, you're shaping how kids see the world.
And according to these sources, maybe even at the cost of those kids being able to think critically, disagree, have those open discussions.
Which is what education should be about, right? So what happens to the students who do speak up? You highlighted stories of student protests being met with, well, what some called excessive force.
And that's where those sanctions from the US and EU come in. Those were specifically in response to alleged human rights abuses during those protests.
So now it's not just an internal Venezuelan issue anymore.
Exactly. The whole world is watching and they're concerned. Those sanctions were a big deal, not just a slap on the wrist. It was basically the international community saying, we see what you're doing and it's not okay.
And it puts Istúriz in a tough spot. He goes from advocating for teachers to facing sanctions for, well, allegedly being involved in suppressing dissent, including from students.
Quite the turnaround.
It really is. And then in 2021, in the middle of all this, Aristóbulo Istúriz passes away.
It's almost like his death brought all those contradictions into even sharper focus.
Absolutely. It's wild, isn't it, how differently people reacted to his death? Like, you had some mourning a leader, someone they saw as a true champion of the people.
The teacher, the union leader, someone fighting for social justice, access to education, those are the parts they focused on.
Exactly. But then others saw his death almost as a line in the sand, like a chance for Venezuela to move on from a really difficult period.
Right, they saw him as part of the problem, you know, the
Right.
corruption, the authoritarianism.
Yeah.
It's like his death, for them, meant a chance to hit reset.
And that's what makes Istúriz so interesting to unpack. He's not an easy guy to define, is he? Not a clear-cut hero or villain.
Not at all. The material you shared, it shows someone straddling both sides of that line. Someone who, at different times in his life, seems to embody both the hopes and the disappointments of a whole nation.
It's almost like you're looking at two different lives, but they're happening to the same person. That's wild.
It really is. You have this passionate educator fighting for something better for his people, and then these really serious accusations of wrongdoing. How do you reconcile that?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do you square those two things? And when we're trying to understand someone like Istúriz, I mean, how much weight do we give to the early stuff, the positive impact he clearly had?
It's tough
Mm.
because you have to balance that against the later stuff. The corruption claims, the power grabs, the stifling of dissent.
It's like trying to put together a puzzle where half the pieces are missing. You kind of get the picture, but there are these huge gaps, so you can't be sure.
And that's where we end up, I think. We've gone through the accusations, the historical context, even what the international community was saying. We've talked about his complicated legacy, how differently people saw him, even in death. But the biggest takeaway, for me at least, is that we have to keep asking these tough questions.
It's not about easy answers, right?
Not at all. It's about digging deeper, questioning things, being open to being wrong. Because understanding someone like Istúriz, it's not about coming to some final judgment. It's about being okay with the messiness of history, the parts that don't fit neatly into a box.
Those gray areas can be pretty uncomfortable, though.
Sure, but they're also where things get really interesting. It's in those gray areas where we're challenged that we actually learn the most.
So for everyone listening, as you go out and maybe do your own digging into Aristóbulo Istúriz's life, just remember, the best questions, the most important ones, they usually don't have easy answers. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep looking for different perspectives. That's what makes all this so fascinating. And who knows, maybe by trying to understand this enigma, we might end up understanding ourselves a little better too.